Good morning, friends. Today's book is The Last Basselope, One Ferocious Story by Berkeley Breathed. A very terribly long time ago, before such things as television and good manners or even children, ferocious monsters roamed a younger, angrier world. Whispered legends tell of a race of razor-horned, slobbery-fanged beasts more ferocious than the others. The stories say that the mere sight of one of them in a dinosaur neighborhood would inspire rip-snorting dinosaur pandemonium, lasting for weeks. Stories also say that a few of these brutes survived those terrible times. They say that just beyond our backyards, deep within the forest gloom, the very last of one of them is still hiding, snarling, eating grizzly bears whole, and waiting to be discovered. They call him the Last Basselope. Nobody read these Basselope stories more closely than a great and famous discoverer named Opus. Now, in truth, Opus was neither great nor famous and had discovered precisely no spotted tigers, no people-eating toads, and generally no lost tribes of Nebraskan cannibals. Even this morning, he couldn't discover 2 clean socks. But he was hopeful. Surely, he thought, a great and famous discoverer such as himself would soon discover something, and a razor-horned, slobbery-fanged basselope seemed a properly ferocious something. An expedition must be formed. Opus found one of his best friends, Bill the house cat, Milquetoast the house bug, and Ronald Ann the house kid watching TV in his living room. Several TVs, actually. Opus flung open the door and pointed out to the sunshine. "The great Basselope expedition is forming outside," he announced. "Ferocious things are still out there. Undiscovered things. Wonderful things." Ronald Ann pointed out that there was a commercial for Tidy Nose allergy spray on TV, which seemed wonderful enough. "Thank you." "Volunteers, please. Form an orderly line outside. No pushing," ordered the expedition leader. But they didn't form any line whatsoever, so he had to drag each of the volunteers out, Ronald Ann twice, by the feet. When Opus finally explained that they would all get on TV once the Basselope was captured, attitudes improved. He assigned responsibilities to each of the expedition members. Bill the cat would carry the survivor gear. Milquetoast would watch for elephants and act as a manager once they got famous. And Ronald Ann would prepare the marshmallow gummy bear milkshakes. Bill discovered some scraps of cardboard, an old set of cow horns, and some nearby trash, and danced around like a basselope, amusing all but the expedition leader. Bill was scolded for goofing off and felt thoroughly useless. "We're off," announced Opus, and with a mail-order basselope net in hand, he led the group out the back gate and down towards the massive trees beyond the gate. They walked deep into the gloom of the ancient forest for many, many miles. The air was deathly still except for the unseen wings of unseen things gliding through the creeping mist. The great Basselope expeditionary force was lost. Then, at their feet, they suddenly noticed an endless glowing carpet of dandelion puffs stretching all directions. Stranger still, a mysterious path had been cut through this miniature white forest. Opus bent down for a closer look. The dandelion tops had been whacked clean off. "Whacked!" shrieked Ronald Ann, horrified. "Clean off," repeated Opus. "By razor-sharp horns," guessed Milquetoast. "The Basselope has been through here," the expedition leader said nervously. They followed the dandelion path into the distance. That evening in camp, nobody really enjoyed their marshmallow gummy bear ketchup milkshakes. It's never an easy easy, enjoying a good meal if one expects to be eaten soon oneself. Opus tucked Ronald and Anne under her blanket and then settled in himself. Bill stood guard in his underwear and tried to feel useful. Milquetoast put some cold cream on his face and retired early, only to jump up, hollering that there was a bug under his blanket. He calmed down when Opus pointed out that it was just himself. In the flickering firelight, Opus thought he saw horrible basalope shapes lurking nearby. He inched his hand out from under the blanket and held a deadly weapon at the ready. It was a long time before he fell asleep. Opus awoke in the morning when a single dandelion wisp landed gently on his nose, making him sneeze. The others awoke to find a little more of the white fluffs floating from the direction of a strange glow just beyond. Sleepily, they dressed and crept towards the edge of the clearing. Peering into the light, they didn't notice the other creatures of the forest, frozen in fear, gazing at the sight below. "Look," whispered Opus. Ronald Ann held her breath. Bill hid his face. Milquetoast ran in the opposite direction, screaming. Opus tipped closer. A single shaft of morning light pierced the thick forest canopy and fell square upon a shiny, grassy meadow. In the middle stood the fierce, the terrible, the Last Basselope. Opus did not see any slobbery fangs, nor did he see any razor horns. In fact, the beast seemed to be humming. He certainly wasn't eating grizzly bears whole. He was nibbling off the tops of dandelions. "Nibbling," Opus sputtered. "This isn't what I call ferocious." The basalope looked up. His nose began to quiver. Both lips curled into a horrible snarl, revealing rows of dripping teeth. The monster began to lumber toward them. "Uh-oh," said the great but not especially brave discoverer. "Retreat! Fall back, backpedal!" commanded Opus, and the entire Basalope expeditionary force went into full throttle, no brakes. Darn the torpedoes reverse. They shot out into a huge open meadow. The spitting, snorting creature followed close behind. Opus collapsed, exhausted, on the other side, and found himself cowering under a massive shadow of dripping teeth and quivering basalope lips. How embarrassing, he thought, for a famous discoverer to die as a basalope snack. The jaw gaped. The monster drew in his lungs for a final dandelion-filled breath, and then... whoa! He sneezed. Oh, not a normal sneeze. Not a run-of-the-mill, namby-pamby, plain Jane, everyday reverse sniffle like yours or mine. No, this was a 10 megaton bull-nosed nasal explosion, propelling the creature backward in a graceful arc through the sky. With a plop, the basalope landed neatly on his bottom, very much as though he had had some practice in all of this. Snuffling, the basalope reached down with one of his huge ears and grasped a leaf, with which he blew his nose. "Gesundheit," the beast said. "Thank you," he replied to himself. He smiled shyly at the expedition members and massaged his stuffy nose. "Dandelions always do that to basalopes," he said. "We really shouldn't eat them, but we do love them so." The great basalope expeditionary force cautiously walked over to the sniffling creature. "The last basalope, I presume?" asked Opus, as formally as he could. The beast lifted his right ear and held it out to shake. "Personal acquaintances call me Rosebud. At least they would if I had any," the creature added with a sigh. "We basalopes have been trying to make for some, 200 million years, but we've never been very good at them." Rosebud grasped a dandelion stalk with an ear and inhaled the wisp with a snort. Again his lips began to quiver. His nose wrinkled into a ferocious sneer. Opus shrank back in horror. Bill covered his eyes. But Ronald Ann pulled out a small spray bottle from her pocket. She squirted the stuff into the Basselope's twitching, snarling honker, which then immediately unsnarled. The box read, Tidy Nose Allergy Spray. Maybe personal acquaintances will be easier to make now, said Ronald Ann, smiling. You can start with us. And to celebrate, they spent the rest of the day collecting huge numbers of dandelions for a grand feast. Actually, only Rosebud did the eating. The others jumped in the pile. Suddenly, Rosebud pricked up his ears. A noise came from deep within the forest, a noise unlike any he'd ever heard before. An avalanche of honking, roaring, squealing cars and trucks burst into the forest. Written across their sides were the names of TV shows and satellite networks, and newspapers and magazines and animal zoos and tour companies. And there, hanging on the hood ornament of the lead vehicle, was former expedition member Milquetoast the housebug, pointing the way. We've got him cornered. Bring him back alive. Rosebud turned to Opus. More acquaintances? He asked hopefully. Many, many more, said Opus, looking quite worried. He thought for a second, then turned to Bill. We have to work fast, he said to the cat. The parade of cars and trucks roared across the meadow. They surrounded the great Basselope expeditionary force, and a mob of screaming people leapt out carrying cameras, microphones, and cages. Milquetoast motioned for silence. I've told you how I captured the monster, the housebug said grandly. And now, if you all just spell my name right in the newspapers, he's all yours. Then Opus and Ronald Ann stepped aside to revere, well, a very unusual beast. Nobody in the crowd noticed, but this Basselope had wieners for horns, tomatoes for eyeballs, and 2 bananas for fangs. To Milquetoast, the monster looked suspiciously like a cat wearing his lunch. The crowd exploded in a blur of whizzing cameras and shouted questions. Milquetoast screamed, You're being hoodwinked, but nobody heard. Opus and Ronald Ann slinked away as the crowd closed in on the beast. The two reached Rosebud, who was hiding under the pile of dandelions, far away from the shouting crowd. I think you're better to leave now, Opus told the Basselope softly. Ronald Ann kissed Rosebud on the nose and slipped him a small spray bottle. Delighted to have made your acquaintance, she whispered. Rosebud hugged her with his huge ears, and then she ran off to help with Bill with the mob. Opus handed Rosebud his last snack for the road. A great and famous discoverer knows that some secrets are better left undiscovered, said Opus sadly. Then I have one more undiscovery, said the beast, just for you. He scrunched up his eyes and his face turned pink with strain. Slowly at first, and then quickly his antlers expanded like glowing balloons. They rose over his head, and gently, ever so gently, Rosebud's little feet lifted off the ground. The stories never mentioned this, said a thrilled Opus, laughing and waving goodbye. A trail of dandelion wisps danced in the last glow of the sunlight as Rosebud drifted gracefully toward a deeper, more distant part of the forest. He hoped that ahead it might be a quieter place, certainly a less ferocious place. He looked back at the tiny figure still waving far below, and he smiled. He smiled because it occurred to him that after a very terribly long time, the world's last Basselope was actually the world's first Basselope with friends. The end.